Our reading this evening is taken from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. 3 absolutely super verses. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Hello, everyone. If you don't know me, my name is Katie, and I'm part of Wildfire Missional Community here at HTL. Woo woo! And it's really an honour to get to speak to you tonight. Can't really see you, but I know you're there. I'm just going to pray before I start. Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you that it reveals who you are. We thank you that it brings challenge and conviction and encouragement to us. Lord, I pray that you would speak through me. Would you use my words? And would you just speak to the hearts of everyone here? Amen. So tonight is the final week of our sermon series on devoted lives, where we've been looking at closely at people through the Bible who have lived lives of devotion, and we have been learning from them about what it looks like to passionately seek God and walk closely with him. You might have guessed from tonight's reading who the final person we are looking at is. Of course, it's Jesus. And there's so much challenge in the passage we've just read. We're confronted with the heavenly reality of all those who have gone before us. We're given the challenge to persevere in our lives of devotion. And we are reminded of the perfect example of Jesus, which puts all of that into perspective. When we look at our endurance and our devotion in the context of the heroes of faith and Jesus himself, it can make our individual races seem small, but we are also reminded of how important they are. So I'm excited to preach on this tonight. So the letter of Hebrews is set amongst a bunch of other letters in the New Testament, written to different churches in the 1st century AD. And Hebrews is unique in that no one is completely sure who wrote it, but we do know who it was for, the Hebrews. They were Jewish converts to Christianity, who would have therefore been very familiar with the Old Testament and Jewish law and religion, but for a lot of them, following Jesus was quite new. And looking at their context is helpful for us as we look further at this passage. And there's a presumed understanding in this text that each of us has a race to run that God has put before us. A race that we are already running, some of us further along than others, and it's a race that isn't necessarily easy. A few weeks ago, I made the questionable decision of signing up for a half marathon this coming September. Woo, yeah. I was actually persuaded by a colleague after mistakenly mentioning to her that one day I would like to do a half marathon. But honestly, I felt great about it when I first signed up. I was telling everyone, guess what? I'm doing a half marathon. It's going to be so great. But the thing about running races is that signing up is really easy. But once you realize what you've got yourself in for, the hard work really starts. And of course, in the passage we just read, the writer of Hebrews isn't talking about a running or any other physical kind of race. They are referring to a race that God has put before us in living our lives for him. So I'm going to use today's passage to talk through 3 points. And for any note takers, I will give you the headings now. First, running is hard. Second, training is key. And third, Jesus ran best. I think one of the main things we can take from this passage is that running the race that God has marked out for us is difficult. The passage says, "Let us run with perseverance the race the race marked out for us." And the word perseverance translates to the ancient Greek word hypomone. I think I said it right. I did Google it, which suggests steadfastness, endurance, and determination, and remaining firm in the face of trials and difficulties. And determination isn't needed for things that are easy. When are we ever determined to do something that doesn't require a bit of effort or overcoming something? I have been determined at times to eat less chocolate, but I have never had to be determined to eat a whole pack of mini eggs. I swear that gets easier every year. I don't know if they're getting smaller or I'm just getting more greedy. And the thing about determination as well is that we will never be determined to do something unless we believe that the end result is going to be worth it in the end. And the letter to the Hebrews has a clear focus on emphasizing the supremacy of Jesus Christ, that he is greater than anyone because he himself is God. And the letter urges believers to remain faithful despite persecution. It's basically saying, look, Jesus is worth it. And the traditional assumption is that the letter was written to Jewish Christians who were leaving the church and returning to the synagogue. We have clues in chapter 10 that the community was facing persecution and imprisonment because of their association with Jesus, and that some were abandoning the faith. The Hebrew Christians had a lot to endure, and even those who didn't experience direct persecution were well aware of the cost of following Jesus. For us in Leicester in 2025, we are blessed that we are unlikely to experience persecution for our faith, but that doesn't mean it's always easy to live out our faith well. We are in a spiritual battle that makes it difficult to live as we might want. Hands up, who feels like living out their faith is difficult sometimes? Looks like most of the room. And I'd be surprised if anyone came to me and said, no, actually, I find it pretty easy. I'd probably be concerned, actually. Paul says in Romans 7, "For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do." I'm going to say it again because it's a bit confusing. What I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And we probably all feel like that at times. I definitely have an idea in my head of how I'd love my spiritual life to look. And most of the time, it doesn't look like that. And a lot of this is what the Bible calls the desires of the flesh. Sometimes it's like we're battling against ourselves. But we also have an enemy who is trying his best to prevent us from connecting with God in any way that he can. And life is unpredictable. Some of us will have experienced real pain and suffering in our lives. And some of us will be in that space right now. Sometimes we'll go through really hard things that mean that just getting through the day is hard, let alone trying to persevere with running in a race. So I appreciate the language in this passage. I'm grateful that the writer doesn't just say something like, "Let us glide with ease, the race marked out for us." I think it's important to acknowledge that living a devoted life is hard, and we are never going to do it perfectly. By acting or believing that we should just be able to get on with it and glide through each day, we're making it even more difficult for ourselves. But this doesn't mean we should just give up. I think the world or our culture at the moment likes to tell us that life should be easy, or we deserve it to be easy, or our goal should be to have an easy life. But that's actually just not true. We were never promised an easy life, and Jesus himself said there would be struggles. In the previous chapter, Hebrews 11, it ends with the writer talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and many others who have lived lives of bold faith and passionately seeking God, despite challenges and hardships. And in this sermon series so far, we've looked at the lives of some of those mentioned and others, and we've learned so much from them about walking faithfully with God. Hebrews 12 starts with, therefore, since we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. The writer of Hebrews is asking us to view our devotion and our perseverance in the context of all those who have gone before us. And there are others as well who we might think of who have maybe after Bible times, heroes of faith who we are all well aware of, or potentially people that we just know personally as well who are an example to us in our faith. Because they've done it before, let us persevere. It's like the writer is saying, let's be encouraged by those who have gone before us. We can do this. And this leads me on to my next point. Training is key. For me, this passage evokes an image of all of us in a stadium on a racetrack with the sound of applause coming from the stands. That might be the same for you as well, as Heather was reading, or maybe it makes you think of your school sports day. I don't know. Either way, on this racetrack, who is going to run the race best? Those who have trained. For my half marathon in September, I'm going to need to do a lot of training. Otherwise, I'm going to really struggle to finish the race. And running that distance is just not something I'm going to be able to do if I go about my life as normal and then just turn up on that September morning. I proved that to myself last weekend when I went on a 10K run. After leaving it quite a while since my last run, my main takeaway was, wow, this is really hard. So to get myself to a point where I'm able to run the race, it's going to take perseverance and planning and time. And we might not think about the need to train for living out a devoted life to Jesus. And it's definitely true that that training for this race will look very different to training for a physical race. Some of you might be quite relieved to hear that. However, in this race we're running, the one that God has marked out for us, we must continually equip ourselves to keep running. We must be sustained, and we can't be passive about that. As I said before, we are in a spiritual battle that makes it difficult to live lives devoted to God. The enemy loves to put lies and distractions in our way to make it harder for us to walk in closeness with Jesus. But God has given us what we need. And if we keep seeking him and looking to his word, we will be sustained. Part of what he called the training plan the writer of Hebrews gives us is to throw off what is hindering us. The verse says, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. We do have everything we need to walk closely with God all our lives. Sometimes the issue is actually that there's too much in the way. Life can feel cluttered, even if most of it is good stuff. And the writer of Hebrews highlights that we need to actively remove distraction and say no to things that will lead us down the wrong path or just distract us from the most important thing. And they don't specifically say what the things that hinder us might be. I think maybe just because it's different for all of us. So in my preparation for my race, I will have to throw off not throw up, hopefully, please Lord, throw off other desires that might stop me from running it well, like a desire just to sit inside where it's comfy and cozy, to eat what I want, to not push myself and just do what feels comfortable. I'll need to throw off distractions as well that get in the way of me training for the race. What might throwing off everything that hinders mean for us in terms of living a devoted life? What in your life is a hindrance to you walking closely with God? For me, one of the things is social media, and to be honest, my complete addiction to my phone. If I'm not really careful, I will waste so much time just scrolling. And then realize I've used up the time I was meant to be praying or reading the Bible. It's just really frustrating sometimes. So in this season of Lent that we're in right now, throwing off what hinders for me has looked like giving up social media. And it's a simple thing, but it's really helped me to reevaluate what I'm spending my time on and be less distracted. I think social media is a really common example that's kind of thrown around nowadays of, especially people of my age or younger, of being a common distraction. But also We can give more time to things that are good as well. Things that are good and necessary and productive can often take the place of God in our lives. So yeah, it's really important to take a step back sometimes and think, what is taking God's place? What is taking up my time that should be given to God? And we must throw off these things, as the writer of Hebrews says, that get in the way of our focus so that we have space and so that we can fix our eyes on Jesus. Because it's Jesus who gives us the strength and the inspiration to keep running, and he is the one who has finished the race and set the perfect example for us. Which leads me to my third point. Jesus ran best. In the second half of the passage, verses 2-3, we read, "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And we are urged to consider him who endured such opposition from sinners so that we will not grow weary and lose heart." As I said, in this sermon series, we've looked at so many examples of lived out love for God and a devoted faith. But here is the ultimate. We arrive, the final one is Jesus. Jesus is the example of closeness to the Father, perfect obedience, a fully devoted life. Jesus is the only faultless example. He is the one we should be trying to look like in everything we do. There's a reason there were once those WWJD wristbands. Don't know if you guys had them. What would Jesus do? We should follow Jesus' example closely, doing as he would. But more than that, we should run this race with him. He is not only the one that we look to as our focus, but he is the one who is with us. In Hebrews 4, we read, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin." Because Jesus lived on earth and experienced suffering as we do, he knows what it's like to be tempted. He knows what it's like to endure pain and look ahead and there's more pain, but still surrender to the will of God. In other words, he truly knows what it is like to run and endure through a race that is hard, but still run it with obedience. And sometimes, if I'm being really honest, I can catch myself thinking that it was just easier for Jesus. I don't know if anyone else feels like that. He had a slower pace of life. He lived in a culture that there were fewer distractions. He wasn't held back by sin and shame. He literally was God and therefore had no separation from him. But the reality is that Jesus went through much harder things in his race than most of us will ever have to go through. At his own synagogue in Nazareth, they wanted to kill him. The religious leaders were constantly trying to trap and embarrass him. He was betrayed by someone who was meant to be his friend. He was mocked and beaten, and his own people cried out against him to crucify him. And Jesus suffered the cross. And the passage says that he did it for the joy set before him. He could look past the horror of the cross to enjoy the good beyond it, the good of a redeemed and rescued people. As I said earlier, to be determined to do something, you have to know that the end result will be worth it. And what Jesus went through was unimaginably terrible. But he looked ahead and was able to endure through it because for him it was worth it. He knew how life-changing his painful, gruesome, and humiliating death would be for all of us and anyone else who has ever or will ever put their trust in him. His joy was that we would all be able to live these lives of faith and that we would have access to the Father without our sin getting in the way. So Jesus isn't only an example for us to look to. He's obviously so much more than that. But he still remains the ultimate example of devotion. I think maybe the most beautiful part of us looking to Jesus in our own endurance is that he is looking right back at us with love and longing, willing us to run these races well. And he has grace as well for when we don't run our races perfectly, when we trip up along the road, when we stop or we veer into the wrong lane. The writer of Hebrews says we should look to Jesus so that we will not grow weary and lose heart. Spurgeon writes, looking unto Jesus means life, light, guidance, encouragement, joy. Never cease to look on him who ever looks on you. And to end, a lot of you will probably be familiar with the hymn, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. And Jip mentioned it in his sermon last week too, so clearly God is wanting to say something. What you might not know is that the hymn was inspired by a poem originally written by someone called Lilias Trotter. And Lilias was born in London in 1853 and felt a calling from a young age to share Jesus with the unreached people groups in Algeria in Northern Africa. And she decided to follow God's call, laying down her budding career as an artist. And even though no mission agencies would take her, she went there alone and served there for 40 years. In her poem, which is named Focused, she talks about the impact of our lives being pointed towards Jesus, suggesting that where our focus is the most important thing about us. She describes seeing a dandelion in the middle of a woods, glowing because of the way that it was pointed to the sun and how the sun was shining down on it. And she talks about having a realization there in that moment about what it means to make the very best of our lives. She writes, gathered up, focused lives, intent on one aim, Christ. These are the lives on which God can concentrate blessedness. And her poem ends with some words which might sound familiar to some of you. She writes, turn full your soul's vision to Jesus and look at him. And a strange dimness will come over all that is apart from him. Alone on the mission field, having surrendered everything, Lilias discovered the beauty, brightness, and clarity in turning one's focus to Jesus. May we all, as we run the race that God has put before each of us, point ourselves towards Jesus, allowing the things of this world and all that troubles us to grow strangely dim in the light of his glory. Amen.
Katie, thank you